The classroom buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Backpacks slumped under desks, pencils clicked in restless fingers, and whispers darted between seats like secret agents. It was presentation day at Crestwood Academy, a prestigious school known for enrolling children of doctors, entrepreneurs, and media personalities. But even in a classroom filled with privilege, there was a hierarchy, and 10-year-old Jackson Musk sat somewhere near the bottom of it. Jackson wasn't shy, but he wasn't loud either. He wore simple clothes, clean, but unassuming. He didn't brag, didn't push himself into conversations, and rarely corrected anyone when they assumed he was just another kid with a weird last name. But today, he was going to do something different. He had worked hard on his class presentation. He had practiced it in front of the mirror, read it out loud to his older brother, and even FaceTimed his dad about it, who had encouraged him with a soft smile and a promise. "Just be you." The teacher, Mrs. Blake, adjusted her glasses and called out, "Jackson, you're up." Jackson stood, his small frame steady but nervous. He walked to the front of the class with his trifold display, board tucked under one arm. On it were printed photos of rockets, astronauts, launch pads, and strange diagrams that most of his classmates couldn't understand. Some rolled their eyes before he even began. He turned around, smiled nervously, and started speaking. "Hi, everyone. My name is Jackson Musk, and today I'm going to talk to you about space travel, reusable rockets, and the future of humanity in space." A few students were already snickering at the mention of his name. He cleared his throat and continued. "My dad owns SpaceX. He started it because he believes humans should be a multiplanetary species, and I think that's really important. Too." That was it. It was like a switch flipped. Someone in the back let out a loud cackle. Another kid leaned to his friend and repeated the sentence in a mocking tone. "My dad owns SpaceX!" They both burst into laughter, clapping their hands like it was the funniest thing in the world. Another student, a girl who had brought in a slideshow about her mom's clothing brand, rolled her eyes dramatically and said under her breath, "Sure he does." Jackson paused, visibly shaken. His lips parted, but he didn't speak for a few seconds. The laughter was growing, rippling through the classroom like a wave of disbelief and mockery. They didn't believe him, not because it was impossible, but because in their minds, someone like him, quiet, average, non-flashy, couldn't be the son of that Elon Musk. Mrs. Blake tapped the desk, trying to restore order. "Class, please. Let's give Jackson the same respect we give everyone else." But it was too late. The damage was done. Jackson's face flushed a deep red, not from shame, but from a mix of frustration and disbelief. These were his classmates. He hadn't said anything outlandish or exaggerated. Everything he'd just said was real. Why was the truth so unbelievable to them? He looked at his board again, his voice catching slightly. This is Falcon 9. It's a reusable rocket that—" Another laugh, louder this time. Something broke inside him. Not his confidence, but his patience. He didn't say another word. He slowly walked back to his desk, eyes locked on the floor, while the classroom dissolved into low murmurs and suppressed giggles. The teacher quickly moved on, announcing the next student, trying to regain control. But Jackson wasn't listening anymore. He pulled out his phone from his backpack, his fingers moving quickly. If they wanted proof, he'd give them proof, and they weren't ready for what came next. Jackson sat at his desk in silence, staring down at his open notebook but seeing none of the lines or scribbles inside. The noise around him faded into a blur, as if he were underwater. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but something inside him had gone still. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. He didn't crave attention. He didn't want revenge. All he wanted in that moment was to be heard and believed. He pulled his phone lower into his lap, careful not to draw the teacher's attention, and tapped open his messages. His fingers hovered for a second before he typed, "Dad, "Can you come to my school right now? I need you." There was no explanation, no context, just a plea. Jackson had never asked his father for something like this. Most of the time, he didn't want people to even know who his father was. But today had crossed a line, and he didn't want to walk out of that classroom just another kid who was laughed at for telling the truth. Seconds ticked by. A minute passed. Then, 3 dots appeared. Typing. Jackson's heartbeat quickened. "Where are you? I'll be there in 15 minutes. He stared at the screen, reading the words again and again, as if they would change, but they didn't. He felt a flicker of something. Not just hope, something more powerful. Something that felt like a rope being thrown down to someone stuck in a well. He straightened up slightly in his seat, his lips tight, but his chest rising, with a bit more air. Outside, the world moved on. Birds zipped past the windows. The sky was clear and blue. Inside the classroom, students continued with their presentations, stories about vacations in Italy, summer tech camps, and parents who were CEOs of beauty brands and cryptocurrency startups. But Jackson heard none of it. He sat like a statue, his fingers gripping the sides of his chair. The countdown had begun. 14 minutes, 13, 12. At the front of the class, a tall boy named Ethan was now presenting. His dad apparently ran a luxury car dealership, and he had brought photos of himself sitting in Lamborghinis and Ferraris. Jackson noticed how quickly the class turned from indifference to admiration. The same kids who had laughed at reusable rockets were now gushing over horsepower and red leather seats. 10 minutes. Jackson could feel it. This shift inside him. A growing sense of purpose. A quiet certainty that something massive was about to happen. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about payback. It was about truth. And truth, when it finally shows up, doesn't need to shout. It just walks in and changes the temperature of the room. 9 minutes. The school security guard stood lazily near the front doors, sipping from a coffee cup and scrolling through his phone. He didn't notice the sleek black Tesla slowly pulling up outside. The front of the school silent as a whisper. The vehicle didn't idle. It stopped completely, the door opening with a soft click. 8 minutes. Elon Musk stepped out, dressed simply in dark jeans and a gray t-shirt. He didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't bring a camera crew. There was no entourage, just a man walking, with purpose, as if this moment mattered more than any launch window or boardroom meeting. Inside the classroom, Jackson's phone buzzed once. At the front office. "They're calling your class now." Jackson looked up, heart hammering. He could feel eyes on him, but he didn't move yet. He waited until the intercom crackled and the school secretary's voice came through. "Mrs. Blake, sorry to interrupt. Can we have Jackson Musk come to the front office, please?" Heads turned. Mrs. Blake raised an eyebrow and gave him a slight nod. "You're excused, Jackson." He stood slowly, sliding his chair back. This time, no one laughed, but the room was thick with curiosity. He didn't look at anyone as he walked to the door. He didn't need to, because in less than 5 minutes, they'd all understand. The hallways of Crestwood Academy were lined with honor roll posters and inspirational quotes about success and innovation, but none of that mattered in this moment. Jackson walked with quiet intensity toward the front office, his footsteps echoing against the polished tile floor. Each step felt heavy, not with fear, but with anticipation. This wasn't some fantasy. He wasn't bluffing. The man who built rockets, who had changed the way the world thought about technology, was here. Not on a stage, not behind a podium, but here for him. He turned the corner and saw his father waiting near the front desk. Elon stood calm and relaxed, hands in his pockets, nodding politely to the receptionist. He looked up as Jackson approached, and in that brief moment everything else fell away. The whispers, the laughter, the disbelief. Jackson wasn't just a boy who had been humiliated in front of his class. He was someone who had been heard. Elon smiled and lowered his voice. "You ready?" Jackson nodded. Together they walked side by side down the hallway, a quiet storm making its way toward the classroom. Staff who passed them looked twice, recognizing him but too stunned to say anything. One teacher nearly dropped her stack of papers. Another paused mid-conversation, eyes wide. The tension began to build, not from confrontation, but from presence. It was the unmistakable hum of power being felt, not flaunted. Inside the classroom, the atmosphere had shifted again. Whispers about Jackson's sudden departure gave way to new speculation. Did he get in trouble? Is he crying in the office? Maybe his dad is here to pick him up early. Mrs. Blake was preparing the next student for their turn when the door suddenly opened. And then it happened. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Elon Musk stepped into the classroom. At first there was silence. Just silence. The kind that doesn't even allow breathing. The kind that freezes time. He didn't need to introduce himself. He didn't scan the room for recognition. He simply walked forward, motioning Jackson to stand beside him, and turned toward the group of wide-eyed 10-year-olds who, moments ago, had ridiculed his son. One student, Ethan, the car dealership kid, visibly recoiled, his mouth hanging open. Another girl with thick glasses and a designer backpack whispered something unintelligible to her friend, who just shook her head slowly, stunned. Mrs. Blake, for her part, stood frozen. She blinked a few times, adjusted her cardigan, and then took a deep breath. "Mr. Musk, wow, this is unexpected." Elon simply nodded. And then, without ceremony, Jackson walked back to the front of the class, picked up his trifold presentation board from the corner where it had been left, and stood, tall beside it again. Elon didn't say a word. He stood quietly at the back of the classroom, arms crossed, eyes calm and supportive. This time, when Jackson began to speak, no one laughed. "This is Falcon 9, he repeated, voice steadier. "It's a reusable rocket, developed by SpaceX. And my dad, our company, has launched it over 200 times. The reason that matters is because we're trying to build a future where humans don't just visit space, but live there." His words hung in the air with new weight. He pointed to diagrams and images, speaking clearly, confidently. He wasn't just reciting facts now. He was reclaiming his voice. And the class listened, not out of politeness, but out of awe. Not because they were told to, but because the truth had finally landed in the room, larger than life, undeniable. Jackson turned to face his classmates, finishing his presentation with a calm but proud nod. "And that's why I think SpaceX isn't just about rockets. It's about hope. It's about making the impossible real." No one spoke, not even Mrs. Blake. Elon stepped forward, not to give a speech, but to place a hand gently on his son's shoulder. It said everything, and in that moment, the classroom that once echoed with laughter now sat silent, filled instead with the unmistakable sound of respect. For a few seconds after Jackson finished speaking, no one in the room moved. The air felt thick, like the moment after a lightning strike, where you're not sure if thunder is coming or if the silence will just stretch forever. But slowly, almost awkwardly, the mood shifted. It began with one student clapping, hesitant, unsure. Then another joined in, and then another. Within moments, the room filled with soft applause, not loud or showy, but genuine. There was no shouting or whistling, just the slow, reluctant surrender of children realizing they'd gotten it all wrong. Jackson's face didn't show triumph. There was no smirk or smugness. He simply stood there, absorbing the moment with quiet strength. He hadn't asked for this applause. He hadn't demanded it. But he'd earned it. Ethan, the boy who had led the initial wave of laughter, lowered, his eyes to his desk, his earlier bravado replaced with discomfort. He shifted in his seat, chewing the inside of his cheek, unable to meet Jackson's gaze. The girl with the designer backpack tried to force a smile, as if to pretend she had been supportive all along. But Jackson didn't seek validation from them. He turned to Elon, who gave him a proud nod, a silent acknowledgement between father and son. It wasn't just about proving a point. It was about being true, standing firm in the face of ridicule, and letting the truth speak louder than the noise. Mrs. Blake stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Thank you, Jackson," she said, her tone slightly more formal now. "And thank you, Mr. Musk, for taking the time to visit. That was incredibly enlightening." Elon simply nodded, still keeping his comments brief. He hadn't come to impress anyone. He had come for his son. But just as the class seemed to be settling down, a hand shot up in the back. It was a boy named Riley, one of the more curious students, in the room. His voice, slightly trembling, broke the silence. "Can I ask a question?" Mrs. Blake looked at Elon, who gave a slight smile. "Go ahead," she replied. Riley swallowed hard, looking between Jackson and Elon. "Is it true you're planning to send people to Mars? Like for real?" Jackson turned to his dad. Elon's eyes lit up just slightly. Finally, a question worth answering. He stepped forward and faced the class. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've already built the Starship prototype. We're preparing for long-term life support systems, fuel production on Mars, and simulated habitation training. Our hope is to launch the first crewed mission in the next few years." The room went completely silent again. These weren't just big words. These were real plans, spoken by the man who had made electric cars normal and turned private space travel into an industry. Another student raised a hand. "Is Jackson going to go?" Jackson looked up, startled. He hadn't expected that question. But Elon just smiled and turned to his son. "That's up to him," he said. The class was buzzing, now minds whirring with possibilities. The kid they had mocked 20 minutes ago had suddenly become something more. Someone connected to the future they only read about in magazines and saw in superhero movies. The bell rang unexpectedly, jolting everyone out of the moment. Backpacks rustled. Desks screeched. But no one was talking about their usual recess plans or trading snacks. They were still watching Jackson. As everyone stood to leave, a small group of students lingered around him. "Hey, that was actually really cool," one said. "Your board looked amazing." "Sorry we laughed. That was dumb." Jackson nodded politely. He wasn't going to pretend it didn't hurt earlier, but he wasn't going to hold on to it either. He had already won something far bigger than approval. Elon leaned down, speaking softly to Jackson so only he could hear. "You handled that better than I ever could." Jackson looked up and, for the first time that day, smiled. A real one. Words spread like wildfire through the school. By the time Jackson and his dad walked through the front office again, nearly every adult in the building knew what had happened. Teachers were texting each other between classes. The principal was seen hurrying out of her office, and even students from other grades had started whispering stories about Elon Musk walking into a fifth-grade classroom and listening to his son give a space presentation. But Jackson didn't care about any of that. He had gotten what he came for. Not just validation, but peace. Elon checked his watch and leaned in. "Do you want to leave early today?" Jackson considered it for a second, but then shook his head. "No, I want to finish the day." Elon nodded, impressed. He gave him a gentle pat on the back. "Then I'll see you after school." As they reached the entrance, a handful of older students stared openly, their eyes wide and unsure. It was clear they knew who Elon was, but none dared to approach. Jackson caught sight of them, but he didn't say anything. He just walked back toward his classroom while his dad headed out. The doors. The second he stepped inside, the energy was different. He wasn't just another student anymore. Something had shifted. Even Mrs. Blake, who usually kept a firm grip on classroom structure, smiled a bit wider and gave him a nod as he returned to his seat. "Glad to have you back, Jackson." The next few hours passed with a strange sort of electricity humming under the surface. Students who hadn't spoken to him in months now found excuses to ask him questions, compliment his project, or try to sit near him during group work. But Jackson didn't gloat. He remained focused, patient, even kind. He could have let the moment go to his head, but he didn't. During lunch, he sat outside on a bench under a tree, a sandwich in one hand, and his science notes in the other. He liked the quiet, but he wasn't alone for long. 3 boys approached, led by Ethan. They stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. Ethan scratched the back of his neck and looked at the ground. "Hey, Jackson?" Jackson glanced up, his face calm. Ethan hesitated. "Look, I was kind of a jerk earlier. I didn't mean to laugh like that. I didn't believe you. And I guess that was dumb." Jackson said nothing at first. He let the silence linger, not to punish, but to process. Then he gave a quiet nod. "Okay." That was it. Ethan seemed relieved. He didn't ask for more. He didn't push the moment. He just nodded back and turned to leave. But as he walked away, something lighter settled into the air, like a knot finally untying. That afternoon, during science class, the students were asked to write down one invention they believed could change the future. Jackson noticed the sudden shift in answers. Last week, kids had written about flying cars and smart fridges. Today, Mars colonization, recyclable fuel, space elevators, a breathable dome for the moon. It was subtle, but it was there. His story, his truth, had sparked something in the classroom. They weren't just laughing anymore. They were imagining. And that mattered. As the final bell rang and students poured into the hallways, Jackson quietly packed his things. He stepped out to the pickup area and saw the black Tesla waiting again. Elon was inside, reading something on his phone. Jackson climbed in, and they drove off without a word. A few blocks later, Elon finally spoke. "You did something amazing today." Jackson looked out the window and said quietly, "I just told the truth." Elon smiled. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do." The next morning, the world outside Crestwood Academy began to notice what had happened inside its walls. Unbeknownst to Jackson, a teacher from another classroom, who had stepped in briefly during the presentation, had discreetly taken a short video of Elon Musk standing at the back of the classroom, watching his son speak about Falcon 9. She hadn't meant any harm. In fact, she had been genuinely moved by the moment. That night, she posted it on her private social media account with a caption, "When your class laughs at a kid for saying his dad owns SpaceX, and then Elon Musk walks in. Respect." Within hours, the video was shared beyond her circle, and, by morning, it had exploded. News outlets, bloggers, Twitter accounts, and TikTokers were all sharing it with captions ranging from stunned admiration to emotional commentary about parenting and perseverance. Proof that humility walks quieter than arrogance ever could. This is how you raise a grounded child in a chaotic world. Forget mic drops. Elon Musk just did a sun drop, a masterclass in parenting. Now that's how you silence bullies. By the time Jackson arrived at school the next day, the principal herself was waiting at the front doors, along with 3 local news reporters who had already requested interviews. Jackson's face flushed with discomfort. He hadn't wanted this to become a spectacle. He walked past the reporters, without saying a word, and went straight to class, just as he always had. But even before he reached the room, he could tell. Everything was different now. Students were whispering even louder, but this time with awe, not mockery. Younger kids peeked around hallway corners to catch a glimpse of him. A few classmates, who barely acknowledged him before, were now tripping over themselves to sit near him or strike up conversations. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Blake had changed the morning schedule. Instead of regular lessons, She had written on the board in big, neat letters. Today's question: what inspires you? She turned to the class. After what happened yesterday, and what many of you have seen online, I thought today we could spend time talking about the people and ideas that push us forward. All eyes turned to Jackson. He shifted awkwardly in his seat, not entirely sure how to handle the attention. But Mrs. Blake gave him a gentle smile. No pressure. But Jackson, would you like to start? He looked down at his desk, then slowly stood up. I don't know if I'm inspiring, he said, eyes scanning the room. But I do know that when people laugh at you for telling the truth, it's easy to feel small. And when that happens, the only thing you can do is keep standing, even if no one believes you. The classroom was quiet again, the same kind of quiet that had fallen when his dad walked in. Jackson took a breath. I didn't want to prove anything yesterday. I just didn't want to walk out of that room feeling like a liar. That's all. Mrs. Blake nodded, visibly moved. One student raised a hand. What's it like, having Elon Musk as your dad? Jackson thought for a second before answering. It's normal. And not normal, he works a lot. But when he's with me, he really sees me. He listens. Yesterday I needed him, and he came. That was the moment the class fully understood. It wasn't about fame or technology or wealth. It wasn't even about rockets. It was about presence. After the discussion, Jackson's desk was surrounded by classmates asking about Mars, AI, and whether he got to try out virtual reality prototypes at home. But Jackson kept his answers grounded, thoughtful. He didn't gloat. He never once said, I told you so. That afternoon, his school inbox had messages from students across the country. Some from kids who had been bullied. Others from children who said his story made them feel brave enough to speak up about their own dreams. One message read, They laughed at me for saying I want to be an astronaut. Not anymore. Thank you. Jackson read each message slowly, his eyes softening with each one. For the first time, he understood the ripple effect of truth. And far away at SpaceX headquarters, Elon Musk sat in a meeting when one of his aides slipped him a tablet with the viral video on it. Elon watched the clip, silent. He saw his son standing at the front of the classroom, heard the moment his name silenced the room, saw the steady pride in Jackson's eyes. And without saying a word, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. That night, Jackson sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of hot cocoa, staring at the glowing screen of his tablet. Dozens of notifications kept popping up. Articles, messages, comments, even a few requests to appear on talk shows with his father. He scrolled past them slowly, not out of disinterest, but because it was all so surreal. Just 2 days ago, he was standing in front of a classroom full of skeptical faces, holding a trifold board and trying not to crack under the pressure. Now, the world seemed to be listening. The sound of soft footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Elon walked in, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his usual late-night thinking attire. He glanced at Jackson's screen and gave him a look that mixed amusement with concern. Too much? Jackson shrugged. A little. Elon sat down beside him and reached for a mug of his own. You did more in that classroom than most people do with a microphone and an audience. Jackson leaned his head against his hand. I didn't want to become a story. I just didn't want them to think I was lying. I know, Elon replied. That's why the story matters. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional buzz from Jackson's tablet filling the quiet. Then Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out something unexpected, a crumpled sketch on paper. Jackson leaned in. What's that? It's the first version of the Falcon 1 design, Elon said, flattening the page. Drawn in the middle of the night on a napkin. People laughed when I first showed it around, said it was a pipe dream, that it would never fly, that it wasn't worth the effort. Jackson studied the jagged lines and scribbled notes. It looked rough, imperfect, but it was the beginning of something massive. Did it bother you? He asked. Of course, Elon said. It always does when people don't believe you. But I realized a long time ago, you don't build rockets for the people who laugh. You build them for the people who are still dreaming. Jackson stared at the sketch a little longer, his heart beating slower now. Calmer. You made them believe? He said quietly. No, Elon said. You did. The next day, Jackson returned to school with the same backpack and same quiet demeanor. But his world had changed. Students greeted him with high fives and nods of respect. One of the teachers asked him to give a short talk to the sixth graders about what it was like to grow up around SpaceX launches. At recess, he found a shady spot under a tree with a few kids from other classes who had never spoken to him before. They asked real questions. Not about how rich his dad was, but about rockets, and Mars, and the future of humanity. And Jackson didn't hold back. He talked about propulsion systems, launch stages, the differences between Falcon 9 and Starship. But more importantly, he talked about why it all mattered. We only get one planet, he said, unless we're brave enough to build a second chance. That simple phrase struck something in them. Later that afternoon, Elon received a call from the school. The principal wanted to know if he'd be willing to return, not to make headlines, but to speak to the entire school assembly about vision, failure, and never giving up. Elon agreed without hesitation. But only on one condition. I want Jackson to be the one introducing me. And so, just days after being laughed out of his classroom, Jackson stood on the stage in front of hundreds of students, a microphone in his hand and his heart pounding in his chest. But he wasn't scared anymore. He looked out over the sea of faces and began. My name is Jackson Musk. Some of you might have heard about what happened in my class. I told the truth, and it made people laugh. But the truth doesn't disappear just because people don't believe it. It waits. And when it finally arrives, it changes everything. The audience was silent, not bored, not skeptical, but silent, in that powerful, attentive way that means they were listening. He smiled. I want to introduce someone who showed me that it's okay to dream big, even if no one believes you at first, because the only thing that matters is what you build. When they stop laughing. And with that, he turned to welcome his father to the stage. The applause rolled in like a wave. Not forced, not polite, but thunderous and raw. Elon walked onto the stage, giving his son a proud pat on the shoulder before turning toward the auditorium packed with students, teachers, and administrators. There were no flashy lights, no big screen presentations, no scripted lines. Just a father and a school community still buzzing from what they had witnessed over the last few days. But what Elon said next wasn't about him. It wasn't about SpaceX, Tesla, or Mars. It was about courage. He spoke about the quiet moments behind every loud success, the failures, the mockery, the nights he had doubted himself. He described launching a rocket that exploded mid-air, and how people called him a reckless billionaire chasing impossible dreams. He talked about how building the future was less about genius and more about grit, getting back up every time something collapsed, and never letting fear outweigh purpose. And then he spoke about Jackson. He didn't ask me to come to his school to prove something. He asked me because he felt alone in telling the truth. And that's when I knew. He wasn't just talking about rockets. He was living the mission. The students listened, wide-eyed, many of them for the first time imagining their own futures, beyond the expected path. Something in the room had shifted again. This wasn't a celebrity appearance. It was a hand reaching through the noise of childhood insecurity and telling them, you matter, even when no one believes you. Especially then. After the assembly, students poured into the courtyard, electric with conversation. Kids who once teased. Jackson now approached him with notebooks, asking for more details about rockets or advice on their own science projects. Others just wanted to stand near him, as if doing so made them a little braver too. And yet, through all the attention, Jackson remained unchanged. He didn't gloat. He didn't act like a hero. Instead, he looked around at his peers, many of whom still had dreams they hadn't dared say out loud, and decided he wasn't going to let this be just a moment. He was going to make it a movement. A week later, with the support of his father and his school, Jackson launched something small but powerful, the Young Dreamers Club. It wasn't exclusive. It wasn't just about science. It was about giving kids a space to speak without fear, whether their passion was astronomy, painting, architecture, or inventing a new type of glue. The first meeting had 15 kids. By the end of the month, it had over 60. Each week, a new student shared a dream, no matter how wild or unrealistic. One wanted to build underwater cities. Another wanted to write a book series about time-traveling historians, and not a single one was laughed at. Jackson's always sat in the front row, listening, encouraging, nodding with the kind of respect most kids don't know how to give yet. He wasn't trying to be a leader. He just was. Back at home, Elon would sometimes catch his son sketching late at night, deep in thought. And he would smile, knowing that something far greater than a viral moment had been born. It wasn't about SpaceX anymore. It was about belief. Months later, as Jackson walked through the school halls, no one remembered the laughter from that presentation day. What they remembered was what followed: the silence, the presence, the transformation. And somewhere in the back of every kid's mind was a voice now that said, even if they laugh, stand up anyway, because the truth always lands. That was the real launch. And Jackson Musk had been the rocket.